All right, welcome back again. We're going to continue on with Chapter 4. And again, we're kind of hitting some highlights from Chapter 4, and I'm going to be adding in a little bit of extra information I want you guys to know about. And so just keep that in mind when you're reading along in your textbook. There's some extra information there, and your Learn Smart homework activities will also have some extra questions delving into some of these subjects in a little bit more detail, and that's fine for those types of assignments. Just keep in mind so that you have to do a little bit of extra reading beyond what I'm expecting you to actually know for the course for testing purposes, gain a little extra knowledge. But just keep in mind, when you're actually preparing for exams, be sure to go by the study guides for guidelines as far as what you're actually going to be tested on. Okay, so let's see here. Moving on, we're going to talk about fungi. So at the end of the last video lecture, I mentioned, there we go. Hang on, I'm having some technical issues here. Okay, so in the last video lecture, I mentioned that we would be talking about eukaryotes in 4 different categories, and one of those is the fungi. All right, so fungi, we mentioned this back in Chapter 1. They're obviously not all macroscopic. You guys have seen bread molds, those are fungi. You've seen mushrooms, those are reproductive structures of fungi that live under the ground. However, they've typically been included in microbiology courses because there are fungi that cause human disease. And so we want to know more about those and be aware of the differences between them and other microorganisms in terms of their structure and how they function. All right, so your textbook tells us there are approximately 100,000 species of fungi, and no doubt there are many fungi that have yet to be discovered. And now macroscopic versus microscopic. So like I just mentioned, we've all seen mushrooms. You've probably seen puffball fungi out in your yard. When you're a kid, you kick those and a bunch of spores come out from the inside of the puffball, and it looks like a puff of smoke. And there are gill fungi like you might see on the sides of rotting logs. And then there are microscopic fungi, such as molds and yeast. Now, I know you can see a mold with the naked eye, but when you're visualizing a mold, you're actually seeing a cluster or a colony of microscopic thread-like fungi, where there's so many of them bundled up together that you can actually see it with the naked eye. All right, so sorry, I'm looking at myself over here on the webcam and it looks all fuzzy, so I don't know if this is a new screen recording version of the screen recording software I'm using, so I don't know if it's going to look kind of crazy to you guys as well. Anyway, fungi can exist in unicellular forms, and those are your yeasts. So yeasts, like when you hear about yeast infections or yeast that you use to make bread rise, yeast used to create beer and wine, those are all unicellular fungi. And you might be thinking, well, those look a whole lot different from a mold or a mushroom or something like that. And it really gets down to the cellular level, the composition of the cells and their function and so forth. Lets us know that even though yeast are single cellular, they need to be classified in the fungus category. Then you have colonial fungi, where you have fungal cells that live together and form clusters. And then you have these more complex multicellular fungi like the mushrooms and the puffballs. Kind of a key thing with fungi is they play roles as decomposers out in the environment. So they generally get their nutrition by breaking down dead stuff and recycling the nutrients from things that have died. All right, so again, fungal cells, yeasts. Yeasts have a round to an oval shape, and they reproduce asexually, so that means one cell divides into two, two divides into four. There's no mating among fungi. You don't have male and female fungi. Budding is a characteristic of yeast as well. If you were looking at yeast under the microscope, sometimes you'll see a larger yeast cell, and when that cell divides, the baby cell kind of looks like that. So that's called a bud. And so basically, a lot of times when you study cell division, you've got one cell that divides into two equally sized cells, and with yeast, there's an uneven division. So when the cell divides, one of the two cells is very tiny, and that's called a bud. The bud breaks off, and then it eventually grows larger and becomes a larger individual yeast cell. Then there are structures that are called hyphae, and these are chains of long thread-like cells which exist together in chains, and they basically form a complex mass that makes up the body of a mold-type fungus. So you see hyphae with molds. So those are chains of thread-like cells. Now yeast can sometimes form something called pseudohypha. Hypha is singular for like one thread. Hyphae refers to a mass of threads. So molds, when they're budding, they can wind up forming chains, and they can kind of fool you when you're looking at them under the microscope because they can take on an appearance that's really similar to the hyphae of mold-type fungi. All right, there are some fungal cells that are kind of interesting, and they're said to be dimorphic, and morph refers to shape and structure. Di means two, so they can have two forms. And these fungi live out in the environment in a mold-like state, so they form these hyphae, these threads. However, when you breathe them in to the body and they encounter human body temperatures, 98.6 Fahrenheit, which is 37 Celsius, they convert over. They change to a yeast-like form, and they function as single-cellular yeast. So there are some fungal pathogens that cause some really nasty respiratory infections that behave in that way, and they're considered to be dimorphic. All right, so here's a picture from your textbook, which is giving you a little bit more insight into hyphal structure, what hyphae look like. And again, if you were blowing these up with a microscope, you would see thread-like structures, and those are really chains of cells that are linked together. Some of them have clear divisions. Those are called septate hyphae, because septum refers to a wall, so we've got like little divisions between the cells, and then in others the hyphae are considered to be non-septate, so it's not as obvious that they have divisions between the cells. So when you're looking at a mold on a piece of bread, that's really a mass of these microscopic threads that are chains of cells, and those are called hyphae. All right, yeast. So again, yeast are just individual fungal cells. Okay, and here's a picture, better than what I just drew on the screen a few minutes ago, of a yeast cell that's budding. And you can kind of see how there's the bud, that's the new little baby cell that's budding off of the original one. And they're showing you there the nucleus on the inside of the yeast cells. And over time, if these buds are staying together in chains, they can form something called a pseudohypha, or false. Pseudo means false hypha. And here's a blow-up in your textbook of an individual yeast cell. And if you look on the inside, all these structures that you're seeing there, like endoplasmic reticulum, storage vacuoles, Golgi apparatus, those are membrane-covered compartments that you find in eukaryotic cells. All right, yeast play lots of important roles. Like I just said, there are yeast that cause yeast infections. There's a genus of yeast called Candida, which is responsible for those if you've ever had a yeast infection before. Sorry, my phone's ringing, but I'm going to ignore it. And then yeasts play really important roles in biotechnology, food biotechnology. They take sugars and grape juice and grain fluids and things like that and convert it over to alcohol so that we have alcoholic beverages. Not that you guys would know anything about that, but yeast are, of course, involved in producing microscopic alcoholic beverages. I'm recording this at the end of the spring semester and I'm brain dead, so forgive me if I'm misspeaking. All right, how about from a medical standpoint? What are some major fungal infections of humans? Now, when you guys, I'll tell you, one of these days I will learn to turn the pen on so that it doesn't flip the slide over. All right, now you guys have probably heard of mold allergies before, and mold allergies occur when people breathe in mold spores. Spores are basically, they're reproductive structures of molds, kind of like fungus seeds, if you will. You breathe those in, and those spores, your immune system overreacts to them if you have mold allergies. So it's not that the mold is growing inside you and causing a true infection, it's that your immune system is overreacting to it like it might to things like dust mites, for example, or whatever it is that you're allergic to. That's an overreaction by your immune system. So a lot of times when we're thinking about fungi, we're thinking more about allergic type reactions. But there are fungi that cause true human disease. So you can have, for example, fungal infections of the nails, pretty common. The mucous membranes, candidiasis, that's a yeast infection. So Candida albicans is a species of yeast that actually naturally lives on and inside your body, but if it overgrows, kind of like we were talking about with C. diff back at the end of chapter 3, if it's there in small numbers, it's not harmful to you, it's normal for it to be there, but if it has the opportunity to overgrow, you can wind up with a yeast infection. And those often occur inside the body along mucous membranes in the mouth, along the vaginal lining of females. Candida yeast sometimes cause nail infections. There are yeasts that cause, fungi that are not in the yeast category that cause infections of the skin, like athlete's foot, jock itch. Ringworm is actually a fungal infection. It's not a worm. Nail infections, if you've seen pictures of fungal infections of the toenails. Now, inside the body, fortunately, there are not a whole lot of fungi that cause true infections in people with normal, healthy immune systems, but there are a few types that cause lung infections or lung and skin infections. And probably around here, the one you would most likely see is histoplasmosis, which is a fungal infection that's a little bit more common, or quite a bit more common, north of here, like up along the Ohio River area, like Louisville and Cincinnati, those areas. All right, here's an image of a fungus that I do want you to have heard about, Aspergillus. Aspergillus is a type of mold that lives out in the environment. You might see it growing on old food. It can actually grow in air vents, in areas with moisture and dirt and so forth. And this is what it would look like if you were viewing it under the microscope. So this is an Aspergillus fungus that it's magnified with a light microscope. You guys are doing virtual microscopy with your virtual lab activities. And right there and right there, you can see chains. Those are the hyphae. So those are making up the body of the mold type fungi. And then this is actually a reproductive structure. So that's called a conidiophore, that structure. So it has a stalk, and on the end here it has a conidial head, and that conidial head is covered with conidia or conidiospores. So do you guys see, hopefully on the picture, I'm going to erase all of that, all these little circular things, those are the conidia or conidiospores that have come off of that head. And if you were looking at this under the microscope, and if you really zoomed in, you would see that you've got a head there that is just covered with these spores. And spores are reproductive structures of mold-type fungi. They're kind of like fungus seeds, so they can be carried off of that stalk, and they travel in air currents and so forth. And if they land in another area that's favorable for growth, they will germinate and create a new mold-type fungus. All right, what about medically? What's the significance of this medically? Well, some people may have allergies to the spores of Aspergillus, but Aspergillus is a type of opportunistic pathogen, and that's a phrase I want you guys to be sure you know, because it's going to come up frequently throughout the semester. A pathogen is a type of microbe that causes disease. An opportunistic pathogen is one that does not normally cause an infection in a healthy individual, but it can take advantage of an opportunity to do so if it arises. So a good example of that would be if you had weakened immunity for some reason. Aspergillus infections are common in AIDS patients. AIDS patients are infected with HIV. HIV has weakened their immune systems dramatically, and when that happens, you start getting infected with things that ordinarily you don't get infected with. So Aspergillus, ordinarily, if you breathed in Aspergillus spores, your immune system's just going to clear them out. You're not ever going to know that they were there. If you have full-blown AIDS, though, and your immune system is weaker, then things like Aspergillus that ordinarily would not be able to grow and survive in the human body are going to be able to do so. That condition is called aspergillosis. When patients have an infection with that type of fungus. Again, Aspergillus is not really something to be scared of. It's very common out in the environment. We encounter it all the time. So if you don't have some sort of underlying problem with weakened immunity, you're not going to become infected with that. Now here's another one I want you guys to have heard of. Penicillium is another type of mold. And of course that name is no doubt reminding you of penicillin antibiotics, and that's because this is the type of mold that produces a chemical that's called penicillin. And back in the 1930s, it was discovered that this penicillin chemical kills a lot of different types of bacteria. So an antibiotic is typically, that phrase means an antibacterial drug. That's how it's most commonly used. So lucky for us, penicillium mold makes a chemical that turned out to be a great drug for killing lots of bacteria. Some other things we can do with penicillium mold: it's useful in cheese production. So it produces enzymes that will curdle the proteins in the milk and make the milk create solids, and those solids are dried and aged and become cheese. Now, as far as reproduction, they also send up these reproductive stalks, conidiophores. And in this picture down here, there's the stalk, and then it almost has like a broom-like conidial head with the conidia, the spores, scattered around. So the spores are more or less in chains, and if you look at these under the microscope, kind of looks like a claw or the end of the broom covered with those conidia or spores. This one's actually smaller than Aspergillus. If you were looking at it in the lab with a microscope, you'd have to use a higher magnification. And this is also an opportunistic pathogen. So we're used to thinking about penicillium. Hey, that makes penicillin. That's a great thing. But in people who have weakened immunity, it can cause infections. All right, and I just mentioned Candida albicans. This is another type of fungus that I want you guys to be familiar with, and this is a type of yeast, which means it's a single-celled fungal organism. You can see here in the picture, I've got this is at 1000x total magnification with a light microscope like we would use in a laboratory, and so you can see the individual cells there. One cell is one individual. In the background here, though, notice those thread-like structures that you can see. Those are the pseudohyphae that have been produced by the Candida fungi. This is another example of an opportunistic pathogen. So probably all of us have some Candida albicans yeast living in your mouth or other parts of the body along mucous membranes, but in some areas. But ordinarily, if it's not overgrown, if the population is kept under control, and the thing that keeps the population under control is that it has lots of other competitors, or lots of bacteria, for example, that live in your mouth and along the same mucous membrane, so Candida doesn't have any opportunity to overgrow. But if you have weakened immunity, or More typically, like we were talking about with C. diff, if you take a strong antibiotic that kills bacteria, that's going to kill a lot of your friendly bacteria that live in your mouth and live in your colon and along other mucous membranes, along the vaginal lining if you're a female. And when those bacteria get wiped out, Candida is a yeast. Candida isn't affected by those types of drugs. That's something to keep in mind too. Typically drugs that will kill bacteria don't kill other types of microorganisms. A lot of people don't realize that before they study a microbiology class. And so that again provides an opportunity for Candida. Hey, it's like it's at a breakfast buffet. It's got all these nutrients and so forth available to it. Doesn't have all these bacterial competitors, and so it's going to overgrow. And at that point, it can start to damage your tissues and cause an infection. So Candida is part of the normal microbiota, or your normal flora. Those are terms that refer to the normal microorganisms that live on or inside your body. And we've already talked about the pseudo-hyphae. Okay, so that's kind of just an overview of a few fungi and some basic features. So like in your textbook where they're going into more detailed discussion of fungal reproduction, we're going to have to leave that out with this course. There are so many different topics for us to cover in general microbiology that we just can't hit it all. So you will encounter some of that information with your reading. There will be a few questions about it on your homework. But again, follow the study guidelines I've given you for what you actually need to review and be super familiar with before you take an exam.